Welcome to Talking Feds, a roundtable that brings together prominent former federal officials and special guests for a dynamic discussion of the most important political and legal topics of the day. I'm Harry Littman. In the closing days of the presidential campaign, Kamala Harris stepped up her attack on the grave dangers to democracy that a second term for Donald Trump presents. As if on cue, Trump himself bolstered Harris's case with an alarming uptick in divisive rhetoric, laced with promises of authoritarian and despotic rule. Yet, once again, these dramatic contrasts produce no apparent movement in an electorate that seems preserved in amber. Final polls of the contest put both Harris and Trump at 48% of the popular vote. For Harris supporters, the ongoing stalemate is exasperating. Not so much because it suggests the election is slipping out of reach. Polls still show both candidates neck and neck, and if anything, Harris inching forward over the weekend. But rather because it reflects a seeming indifference from nearly half the country to what Harris voters see as the urgent prospect that a second Trump presidency could demolish constitutional norms and the rule of law. In fact, Harris has had continually to temper her warning calls about Trump with bread and butter issues because voters appear more responsive to the economically focused populist messages than to dire warnings about Trump's singular threat to our democracy. To help break down where things currently stand for the candidates and what could bring one or the other a small advantage in the next week that would deliver the presidency, we are joined by three experts who bring both great knowledge and deep practical insight to the confusing political landscape. And they are Beto O'Rourke, the former representative for Texas's 16th Congressional District, a position he held from 2013 to 2019. He thereafter founded and currently leads Powered by People, a Texas-based organization dedicated to expanding democracy and achieving democratic victories through robust voter registration and direct engagement efforts. It's been a while, Beto. An honor to have you back. Thanks so much for joining.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Tara Setmayer, the co-founder and CEO of the Seneca Project. Formerly, Tara was a CNN political commentator and Republican communications director on Capitol Hill. She's a resident scholar at the UVA Center for Politics and, at least in the home stretch, a pretty frequent guest on our podcast, which we're really grateful for. Thanks, as always, Tara, for joining.
Always a pleasure, Harry.
And another Talking Feds stalwart in the fall of 2024, Ali Vitali, the Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC News, where she's covered national politics for close to a decade, including every major election from the campaign trail since 2016. Her first book is Electable: Why America Hasn't Put a Woman in the White House Yet. And that yet seems a very good jumping off point for our discussion. Ali, thanks so much for being here.
You got it. That subtitle gets more and more apt, potentially by the day.
There you go. By the day, by the hour. It does feel like we're in a sort of stasis where millimeters shift up and down and people seize on them, maybe wisely, probably not. And in fact, let's start with the signal feature of this campaign going into its final week, which is that after an initial bump for Harris when she got into the race, we've had 3 months during which the needle has barely moved, and final polls have come out and things are in absolute dead heat, far closer than they were in either of the last two elections. Is it that the campaigns have matched each other blow for blow, including error for error, or is the fundamental even divide in the country just too structural to be budged at all?
Well, listen, I think that there are a lot of factors that contribute to where we are right now. And I think that the way the media has covered this in some aspects has normalized Donald Trump's insanity and the dangers of what he's saying and doing, that a lot of these things have been now baked into the cake, as they say, which irks me and which I've warned about for several years, that normalizing him is more dangerous than anything. The normalization and the enabling by those in the Republican Party, my former party, it's partially why I left it. And the fact that Kamala Harris is being held to a different standard, not saying that there aren't areas of scrutiny that are warranted, that's fine. But you can't hold her to a standard that in a political game, in a political universe of like what we used to do when we had a normal candidate compared to Donald Trump. Because if you do that, you create a false equivalency. And the fact that we have a candidate, well, first of all, he's a convicted felon, and that seems to just be a shrug. The cases against him with Jack Smith and very serious accusations with fact patterns that should be very disturbing to the average American, just a shrug. The fact that Donald Trump has been leaning into xenophobia, racism, and misogyny as the stalwarts of his campaign, hallmarks of it, it's a shrug. The fact that he has been incoherent and physically diminished and the oldest candidate with cognitive decline, it's a shrug. The fact that he is lying so viciously about so many things, as usual, it's a shrug. But Kamala Harris hasn't sealed the deal because she only did 8 points out of 10 points of an economic plan. There's something fundamentally very wrong with this. And I think the average American who doesn't follow politics the way we do has seen this inherent false equivalency and been able to just shrug off very, very dangerous existential things that Donald Trump represents versus her. The contrast could not be more stark.
There's a suggestion in what Tara said that sometimes it seems like it had to be this way. This is where people stood. But other times people have said that it was a contingency that the media kind of created in the way things covered, that the shrug is media induced as opposed to you're baked into the electorate.
Well, I think there's a lot going on, and I have to agree with everything that Tara said. And Van Jones the other night after the CNN town hall said, I feel like Donald Trump and Kamala Harris are taking different exams to the point that Tara's making. And the electorate, perhaps the media, the country is holding her to a far different standard. The former president, unencumbered by truth or facts or reality, is able to kind of glide beyond or above all this stuff. And there's a lot being said about the word fascist and fascism right now for good reason, following the revelation about John Kelly's time as the president's chief of staff and his concurrence with the use of the word fascism. But one of the things that makes fascists successful is the absolute undermining of objective truth and calling the media the enemy of the people and completely destroying the ability to reference any kind of true north or fact as we try to make decisions. I've been on college campuses and registering young people across the state of Texas over the last year. It may not surprise you all, but it surprised me. One of the questions I get most frequently from 18, 19, 20-year-olds is, what is the truth? Hey, Beto, how do you find out what's going on in this country? Unlike my generation, they're not reading the newspaper. They're not watching broadcast television. They may or may not tune into this podcast or watch MSNBC. By and large, they're flooded with whatever's coming across their feed on TikTok, on Instagram. Maybe it's true, maybe it's not, and they can be forgiven for wondering what to do. And so that's the environment in which this fascist, Donald Trump, is really flourishing far beyond what any of us think should be possible, given the fact, as Tara said, that he's not only indicted, that he is convicted, that he has called for insurrection, that he's now talking about turning the United States military against the enemies within, and he means Democrats and those who disagree with him politically. I think that has a lot to do with the dynamic that you just described, Harry.
For me, I think while I agree with the premise of a collective shrug, and Congressman O'Rourke references the idea of what John Kelly has said this week about Trump being a fascist in Kelly's own esteem, many of the other things that have been referenced here, I think they all create a very heavily layered cake. And certainly that's always been the cake that we've looked at for Donald Trump before every single election, both in 2016 when I started covering him and the quote unquote October surprise was all of these allegations from various women, with the final allegation being captured on the Access Hollywood tape. There have been shrugs collectively throughout. The thing I would fundamentally disagree with is that it's the media who is meeting them with a shrug. It's voters consistently throughout this entire campaign. And if the Access Hollywood tape was the, oh my God, unfathomable moment of 2016, then in 2020, it was certainly the pandemic. And now you could basically pick any number of them, but I would argue that an attempted assassination of a former president is a pretty wow moment that we never thought we would see in this country. If it's not that, then it's the Democratic ticket being replaced by his vice president because he is stepping down at the 11th hour in a campaign. And none of those things fundamentally shifted this race, in large part because I do think the electorate itself is shrugging. And that is, I think, a feature of Trumpism. He has just exhausted the American psyche to a point that most voters are still voting the way that we always know them to vote, which is on their pocketbooks. What do things cost? How is my life going? But there is a fundamental exhaustion that is now in this cake in a new way, baked in, that we didn't have in 16 or 20 because 2024 is just a more exhaustive point of it. I don't think that that's because of the media. I think every single time that Kamala Harris newly calls him a fascist or Biden says that he is afraid of a slide towards fascism, I mean, those are remarkable things for the leaders of our country to be saying. We are telling the American people as media people that that's what they're saying. And the electorate's saying, all right, I'll see you on election day.
To Allie's point, I think that there are individual journalists that are doing their jobs like her.
And I'm never here to take it personally, right?
No, I know. But I just want to be fair because, it's not all media, right? But I think when I say media, I think there's been a certain decision from higher ups, the way to put these things in context. Yes, you can report them and you're on the ground and you're like, I'm reporting it. But there are editorial decisions that are made with how your information is being put out there, particularly with print. We saw the Washington Post editorial board has decided not to endorse. In this moment, given what's at stake, that's journalistic malpractice. Because in my opinion, that is making a false equivalency here between what's at stake with the decision to endorse Kamala Harris versus Donald Trump. How at the LA Times, something similar. Coming from, this cannot be coming from the good of the country perspective. I mean, the Washington Post, the Democracy Dies in Darkness paper, the Pentagon Papers, Watergate, Woodward and Bernstein, and you're telling me in this moment, you're not going to take a position? That to me is an example of the way they put these things in context. The same thing with the economy. Well, why is it that the voters have a collective shrug about some of these things or feel that the economy isn't working for them or that Biden has not been a great president in that area despite all the achievements and despite the improvements? It's because it's the way it's covered. During Donald Trump, we had headlines constantly about how great, the stock market was and we're record this or that. And we didn't get that. How many people don't know that inflation went from 9% to almost 2% or why that's important and how that's benefited them? It hasn't been covered that way. And so it's those kinds of things is what I'm saying about the way things are put in context. That's why a lot of times the American people shrug at it because they're like, it's not presented to them why they should care or what the facts are for them to go, oh, I didn't know that.
The economy polling point is one that I actually think is so fascinating because I think polling has a lot of pitfalls. We've all seen, lived, experienced all of that. I was sitting at the New York downtown Hilton at Trump headquarters in 2016, just watching that New York Times needle with all the polling and predictions, right? We know that it's a fallible system. However, I think the economy question from a polling perspective, A, is one we talk about a lot, but B, it's one that I actually had my mind open to a little bit because I was talking to this woman who runs Galvanize Action. They have been doing polling specifically of white women voters. And they show that, yes, when you talk to women about the economy broadly, direct purse string issues, how much do things cost, how is my family spending money, that Republicans do tend to win among this specific sect, very important voting bloc for this country. But the economy question starts to get a little bit different when you actually start asking them about aspects of the care economy, which is where all the legislating that Democrats did in the first 2 years of the Biden administration really comes in. And so I just think polling might not be there and equipped to capture the various ways that people are thinking about the economy right now, because yes, it's the economy from a dollars and cents perspective, but it's also the economy from a sense of, is childcare something my family can afford? Will that system be allowed to exist? Because so much of the childcare system itself is sort of just like held up by tape and a little bit of glue and desperately needs investment. But those are different pieces that our polling just doesn't necessarily capture, but that voters themselves are seeing a distinction in. And so I don't think it's fair enough to say like the economy just broadly tilts for Republicans and is a bad thing for Democrats. It's a tough and thorny one.
Well, something like this plays out across the board. It's the same thing. His signature issue of immigration. He seems to have been making inroads among Hispanic voters who say in polls that they're for what sounds like tough immigration at the border. On the other hand, they're for even more a pathway to citizenship. Now, there's a disconnect there, but you don't get to the disconnect until you understand what the deportation plans would be. But I do think this goes to your exhaustion point, Elaine. It's got to be part of it. We've had time after time after time. In my own little world, the last big development was the release of the brief with all the information from Jack Smith and narratives in black and white. And it was about a half-day story, maybe. You got to really feel for Harris. She's obviously been, the summer of joy has kind of been replaced, right, with a fall of, sobriety and mourning. But even as she does, I really noticed this at the town hall. For many people who care about this issue, she says, they also care about bringing down the price of groceries. They also care about our democracy and not having the president who admires dictators and is a fascist. So even the mere articulation of the pro-democracy point, it's an overwhelming fact that the chief of staff came out and, the different people who have. But it feels like she's got a kind of snake bit dynamic, can be damned if you do, damned if you don't, in a way that there's nothing he can do, it seems, to alienate the base. He's come out with flat fascist tropes this last week. Immigrants polluting the blood of the nation and such. No demerits, no points off. And that's just something I think that's going to take us a long time to understand what the hell's going on.
Volumes will be written about that.
Yeah,
Far
right.
beyond our lifetimes. I often say that this will be a generational fight. No matter what happens on November 5th, this is a generational fight in a lot of respects. And because of how baked in and because of the fatigue and because so many Americans shrug it off and aren't as alarmed as many of us are about what we're seeing coming out of MAGA and Donald Trump, that is a much larger societal problem that we need to face as Americans, but we have to make sure we don't lose our democracy first, one step at a time.
Well, it's true. Although then you have all these individual interviews. Democrats are constantly castigated for not respecting enough the views of Trump supporters and not understanding their fundamental decency. But how decent people don't think they've got to get off the train now. And it's really picking up speed. One last question about the Harris campaign. You're in the final stages. We're pulling out all the stops when Harris is joined on the stage by Bruce Springsteen, not to mention Barack Obama, Tyler Perry, Spike Lee, Samuel Jackson. We're taping Friday. Beyonce is appearing now. Everyone, that's, to put it mildly, a lot more star power than Kid Rock. Now, Tara, as a former Republican, you've encountered this on the other side, right? It feels like, come on, it's the cooler party. People want to be with the cool people. But does all that not really rub off on the candidate?
Listen, in the greater scheme of things, it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't matter. I mean, we appreciate all of them and them coming out and using their platforms to speak out. I mean, for Seneca Project, we had a fundraiser last week and Mark Hamill was on our fundraiser speaking out, as he's been using his iconic status as Luke Skywalker to help raise money and get the vote out in this election and at risk to his career. He mentioned how his agent and his colleagues were like, are you sure you want to speak out? This could alienate. And he was like, I'm sorry, I don't care. No job or anything is worth me being silent over how important this election is. And I have a lot of respect for that. And for people that it's a risk to do that when you're in the public space like that as an entertainer. People are still waiting to see if Taylor Swift will appear with Kamala Harris between now and then. And where it does matter is getting the base out. I don't think it changes votes. It energizes the base. And that's important in the final stages of the election now, like we were saying before. That's where it does matter. It doesn't matter in the persuadable area because everyone knows that Hollywood, they're the leftists and they're the elitists and okay, whatever. I mean, but it does help get out the vote. And that's what they need to shore up your base at this time. And so, yeah, I mean, that's great. It shows a certain type of America, but then there's other parts of America that look at that and they scoff at it. So I think that we shouldn't put too much stock in that other than it is a get out the vote effort to shore up the base.
Can I follow up with that very point? Because you have now people coming out and giving you James Carville saying, here are the 4 reasons why I think Kamala Harris will win. And you have Nate Silver saying, my hunch is Trump. But they cite things that all more or less seem baked in already, like that there's an advantage in money. Except this is the big difference. And Beto, it's why I really wanted to go to you, because you've been in a super close race where so much has turned on something that we really don't see, is not transparent to us as we're here now, which is the get out the vote efforts. Can you just speak to whether that is the likely unseen variable that matters the most now, and how much does it matter?
Well, I think Tara's right about, I think there's maybe marginal benefit to all of these star-studded events like the one that's going to take place in Houston with Beyonce and Willie Nelson. It doesn't hurt. It probably helps insofar as it motivates people who are on the fence, not about voting for Kamala Harris over Donald Trump, but just voting at all. Maybe excites that part of the electorate. So we run this group called Powered by People in Texas. We've been doing voter registration. And then after we register someone, and typically these are students, young people, 18 to 22, 23 years old, we ask them, can I get your cell phone number? And would it be okay if I stayed in touch with you ahead of this election? It's harder to vote in Texas than it is in any other state. They make it particularly hard for young people, and in communities of color, it is even harder. That's where the majority of the polling place closures have occurred, for example. So our theory of the case is if I can stay in touch with you on a personal basis, not a broadcast text or email, but hey, Harry, it's Beto, early voting just started. Want to make sure you know where your polling location is. If you have any questions, I am here for you. I am your voting Sherpa. If those young people that we and many other groups have registered turn out in numbers proportionate to their share of the population, and they almost never do, but if they do in this election, I think you're going to see some really surprising, on the positive side for Kamala Harris, things happen in places like Texas, like Arizona, like Michigan. As we all know, these 18 and 19-year-olds who just joined the electorate, just got on the rolls, they were never part of anybody's polling universe. They're not on anyone's radar. Historically speaking, they're not supposed to vote. And I guess statistically speaking, that's unlikely that they will. But if they do, I really think that makes all the difference. When I ran against Cruz in 18, we incessantly showed up on college campuses. Young voters turned up at an increase of 234% from the previous midterm election. While we didn't beat Cruz down ballot, we picked up a dozen state house seats. This guy named Colin Allred defeated Pete Sessions in North Texas. 17 Black women won election to judicial positions in Harris County. So it was really transformative, and young voters were at the vanguard of that. Will they turn out this time? I actually don't think we have the data. I don't think that Nate Silver or anyone has enough line of sight on these young voters. My feel is, from spending so much time with them, that they have the capacity to turn this election, maybe producing the one Democratic pickup that we need to at least get to 50-50 in the Senate here against Ted Cruz with Colin Allred in Texas, and maybe being the margin of victory in places like Arizona and some of these other tighter battleground states.
You bring up such a good point about the role of down ballot races here. And I know that I'm a Congress nerd in a presidential year world, but I do think that when you look at the way the map is for the Senate races, specifically when you look at places like Texas, the lone pickup opportunity. I know some people like to argue that it's also Florida. I don't think so. I think years of Democratic lack of investment in that state has really atrophied the state party. But I think abortion is also the X factor here. So again, when you talk about turnout modeling, everything is so non-predictive because we're in such a weird, uncharted space. But I also think about the House map a lot. And I've been spending a lot of time traveling to New Mexico's 2nd Congressional District and the Hudson Valley of New York, which is very much a battleground and also remains my hometown. So I got to see my parents, and I also got to go on the campaign trail. But the thing that it says is that even if people might be exhausted by Harris v. Trump, there are other entry points for them electorally, whether it is Colin Allred's race in Texas or it's Pat Ryan's race in the Hudson Valley of New York on the House level. There's a bunch of different entry points. And then that's nothing to say of the ballot initiatives in places like Nevada or Florida or Montana has its own on abortion and reproductive health care.
Arizona.
These are all various. Arizona, of course, is one of them too. Like, New York has one. There's a bunch of different entry points for people, whether they're young or older or just disillusioned. And I think that's the thing that's going to be hard for us to think about too, because I truly can't help but feel like the chaos of the last 2 years of covering the House of Representatives was not the early indicator for the rest of the country that the House mirrors the rest of the country and it's insanely closely divided. And so, of course, we would end up in a position where 10 days out from election day, 8 days out from election day, we would have kind of a shrug of, I don't know who's going to win. I mean, there's different things you could pick from both sides to say that it's going to be Trump or it's going to be Harris. I feel like the House was telling us this all along. It's just kind of going to be a little bit of a slog through the chaos until we get results.
And the funny thing, too, about this, to your point, Allie, is that, like, I think this is also the first time that the House and Senate races have really gotten very little coverage on the national level. Like, in the past, you've had the presidential, that's always going to dominate. But control of the House and Senate has also been a subtext that was covered pretty intensely. This time, we all forget control of the Senate is on the line. It's 50-50. Control of the House is on the line. It's that close. Let's say Kamala Harris does win, but then the Democrats lose the House and the Senate. What does that look like? It's so close. What's happening in New York, in your home state, where New York pretty much made the difference in 2022 with control of the House? And that's changed now because of district lines and drawn and different candidates. And the fact that Hakeem Jeffries and House leadership has been out in New Mexico. This matters. Every seat matters and who's in play and what's not. It's really pretty fascinating how much of an afterthought in the national press, really, that the down ballot races have been. And it really makes a huge, huge difference in how our country is governed, regardless of who wins the presidential election.
When Congressman O'Rourke, you said you were in Tucson recently, the first thing I thought of was, oh my God, do you hear about Juan Ciscomani there, who is the freshman lawmaker in Arizona that is very much playing defense and could be a pickup opportunity for Democrats? I mean, that's key in that state.
Or Jonathan Nez
Yes.
in the Flagstaff area. Nobody had that on their radar at all. And I think he's polling neck and neck in a district that was drawn to favor one of the most conservative members of the House right now. And as you know, he was the former leader of the Navajo Nation, has a huge constituency in that part of northern Arizona. That would be a real shocker. And you're right. And I think one of the things I learned from the Senate race is the conventional political wisdom among many, maybe present company excluded, is that the coattails are ridden by the down ballot candidates. What I found as a Senate nominee in 2018 is I benefited from all the county commissioner, justice of the peace, state house, state Senate, congressional races. They energized those communities across the 254 counties, and the votes flowed up to the top of the ticket. So, Allie, great point. I think these hotly contested local races, including congressional races, they may very well decide the outcome in some of these tight states right now. And Tara, you're right. I don't really hear about it so much,
right?
Apart from the reporting from Allie and others that I follow. But I really don't hear about these races. It's just dominated by, as you know, it's understandable, by this match between Harris and Trump. So let's see if they don't make the difference.
It's time now for our sidebar function, in which we ask a well-known person to explain an important concept in the news. And the concept today is limits on campaign advertising, legal requirements for what candidates must, can, and can't do in the ads that have been ubiquitous these last couple months. And to explain that important topic, I am really happy to welcome the multi-talented Jack Black, a renowned actor, comedian, and musician, best known for his iconic roles in High Fidelity, School of Rock, Gulliver's Travels, Bernie, Kung Fu Panda, Tropic Thunder, and the Jumanji franchise. Jack was nominated for a Golden Globe for his work in School of Rock and Bernie, and he received a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame in 2018. He is also, of course, the lead vocalist of the comedy hard rock duo Tenacious D, and he and his bandmate won a Grammy for Best Metal Performance in 2015. I give you Jack Black on limits on campaign advertising.
Limitations on political campaign advertising. During any federal election season, our TVs, radios, and phones are flooded with campaign advertising. Whether in the form of dramatic commercials or images of beaming candidates, attempts to attract votes are everywhere. But what are the parameters for these communications? Can a candidate say whatever they want? Can they make promises they don't intend to keep? The answer is more complicated than you might expect. The FEC, or Federal Election Commission, provides broad guidelines for campaign advertising, regardless of who or what group is behind it. The clearest bedrock principle is that any sort of public communication on behalf of a candidate must include a clear and conspicuous disclaimer. That rule applies regardless of the form of the advertisement. Example, broadcasts, radio bits, newspaper or magazine snippets, billboards, and mass mailings. And the funding source, a political action committee, PAC, a corporation, or an individual. Moreover, the rule applies whether or not the ad explicitly asks viewers to vote for a candidate, so long as it is related to a political campaign. In terms of the content of the disclaimer, it must include who paid for the communication and, depending on the type of communication, whether it was authorized by any candidate or candidate's committee. Thus the familiar coda in political ads where the candidate says they approved this message. Turning to the content of political advertisements, the situation is more murky and more problematic. Unlike commercial advertising in general, which is governed by a bevy of rules to protect against false speech, political ads are essentially no holds barred. Effectively, a candidate can lie or hyperbolize in an advertisement and face no legal repercussions. This is a result of the court's strong enforcement for the First Amendment rights of candidates and political speakers, which provides extensive speech protection to all public discourse, which includes campaign ads. For Talking Feds, I'm Jack Black.
Thank you, Jack Black, for that explanation. Just a couple points to add about the phenomenally broad reach of Jack Black. He also has, as most people know, the wildly popular YouTube channel, Jablinski Games, where he publishes gaming videos and other content. And maybe my two favorite moments of Jack Blackdom, his hilarious turn as Jeff Portnoy in Tropic Thunder, and his surprising tour de force singing "Let's Get It On" at the end of High Fidelity. All right, it is now time for a spirited debate brought to you by our sponsor, Total Wine and More. Each episode, you'll be hearing an expert talk about the pros and cons of a particular issue in the world of wine, spirit, and beverages.
Thank you, Harry. In today's spirited debate, we dig up the dirt on the agave plant to find out the difference between tequila and mezcal. So first things first, tequila is a type of mezcal, much like bourbon is a type of whiskey. In general, tequilas are mezcals, but not all mezcals are tequilas. Allow me to explain. Tequila can only come from the blue agave plant in specific regions of Mexico, like the region of Jalisco, where the city of Tequila is located. No coincidence there. Mezcal, however, can be made from many varieties of agave, specifically from the heart of the agave, known as the piña. The distillery process for tequila and mezcal is also different. Tequila is produced by steaming the blue agave and then distilling it in copper stills for a toasty, clean taste. On the other hand, mezcal, which appropriately means oven-cooked agave, is cooked in earthen pits with wood and charcoal before being distilled in clay pots. No wonder mezcal, which is typically consumed straight, has more of a smoky, earthy taste. Of course, the best way to get to know the differences between tequila and mezcal is to pick up a bottle of each from your Total Wine & More and pour hundreds of years of tradition right into your glass. Cheers!
Thanks to our friends at Total Wine & More for today's A Spirited Debate. Tara, you've twice made the point now that it's not going away. You think of certain fascist or autocratic leaders as having their day of reckoning, their Nuremberg trials, or at long last, sir, have you no decency? It's a certainty, isn't it, that in December or May, Donald Trump will be the most powerful person in the Republican Party. The House Republicans will still be deeply, invested in Trumpism. And you think about where the court is, and then there's a lot of damage he can do just on his own. I'm back to my parochial viewpoint about the Department of Justice, but, that could in a month be hollowed out. But man, oh man, if one or two houses go Republican also. And let's just spend 30 seconds on this. My sense is that Democratic strategists are worried about the Senate and somewhat sanguine about the House. Would that be the fair summary?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. Just the Senate map was always not in favor of Democrats, but without all the other external factors, with Manchin retiring in West Virginia, with John Tester in Montana, Sherrod Brown in Ohio. Given the way Ohio has gone in the past, I mean, he may still pull it out, but he's in trouble. I think Tester's gone. The Senate race in Arizona is interesting. Ruben Gallego is winning. Carrie Lake is just such a terrible candidate, but that Senate race is not reflective of the presidential numbers. So you may see a split ticket there, which I think is fascinating. House races, you've got like John Avlon out in Long Island. That could be a pickup for Democrats, and Mike Lawler, and what's going on with Mondaire Jones in New York as well. And then you have some of these California districts. Like, it's all so close. But the Senate race, I think the Senate is, unfortunately, I would rather the Senate stay Democratic actually than the House, just because that's more of a stopgap if, God forbid, Trump wins, because of confirmations and judges and foreign policy, impeachments, like all of those things. The Senate really is the stopgap that we need versus the House, but it can't both go Republican. That would be a disaster.
All right, let's focus in a little on the man who would be tyrant. Trump has, I think, changed his harmonies, if not his music, a little bit in the last 10 days. He's gotten even more vicious and nasty and mendacious. I mean, we are talking about, Tara, about the historical perspective. People are going to read that immigrants are poisoning the blood of our country. January 6th is a day of love. Democrats are the enemy within. Use of military against political opponents. One violent day could curb petty theft. It's a question that I found not very fruitful to try to think too hard about for 9 years now. Nevertheless, do you see it as the campaign's efforts to dig deeper under rocks for MAGA types who haven't voted in the last two elections? Or he's just, unhinged and just letting it roll?
I think it's all of the above, but Allie's the one that's been on the trail.
So here's the thing with Trump. And I remember this back in 2016, then in 2018, during the midterms, he did it, 2020. At every point where Trump feels he is on unsteady ground, he turns back his rhetoric against immigrants. In 2016, it was the Mexicans who are rapists and murderers coming down the escalator, and he finished with a similar closing message. In 2018, it was the caravan. In 2020, it was the otherization around COVID and the ways in which he talked about that in racist terms. The fact now that he's here...
The debate where he was off, all he said was immigration. He just went back to, yeah.
Exactly. We've seen this as sort of like Donald Trump's safe space on an issue repeatedly throughout time. And so it's not shocking to me that this is always his final salvo, and it's the place that he comes back. I remember just a few weeks ago, Harry, you and I were on the podcast with Stuart Stevens. We were talking about the idea that otherizing has always been a feature, not a bug. And so, yes, it might be a way to turn out more MAGA folks. That could be. But whereas Kamala Harris has had a methodology of, okay, I'm going to end my persuasion period by doing a series of events with Liz Cheney. I'm going to try to reach out and persuade people who might be disillusioned. Now they're going into get out the vote. No more persuading. We're all about getting people out to vote, bringing Beyonce, energizing the base. That's not what's happening at Trump's level. Certainly that might be where Susie Wiles and Chris LaCivita want him to be, But that is not the kind of candidate that he is. And so I'm not shocked that this is where he is. He's always been calling the shots. He gets on stage and he's untouchable for however long he's on the stage. That's always been what people like about him, and also what Republican strategists pull their hair out over, saying, my God, this is not how I would run. But it's 50-50. So who knows if it's the wrong or the right thing to do politically.
He's a genius at directing the spotlight to himself. And I've got to think, talking about Arnold Palmer or reinforcing this fascism that he's being attacked for, the conventional politician retreats or even maybe, God forbid, apologizes or said, that's not exactly what I meant. And he just doubles down because he knows it sparks outrage. He knows we'll be talking about it. He knows it consumes the airwaves. And I do think it actually pumps up his base and reminds not all of them, but many of them, why they're so excited for this guy who is, not that this is a matter of being politically correct or not, but that's the language that I hear people using. That guy is not politically correct. He's just blown apart the guardrails. This system doesn't work. He's going to drain the swamp. He's going to blow it up if that's what he has to do. And there are a lot of people in America that we just have to acknowledge really, really like that. Doing the McDonald's thing. I mean, people can scoff and roll their eyes. It was fucking genius. I'm sorry, because it got people talking about him doing that. My concern with the Harris campaign, if I have any at all, because I think she's done a remarkable job given the short runway she had with which to lift off, is that some of this stuff, the Beyonce, Willie Nelson, big rally in Houston, as amazing and exciting as it is, and it's so awesome that's happening in Texas, it's fairly conventional. I wouldn't be surprised if Barack Obama did that or Hillary Clinton did that or Joe Biden did that. And look, the one disruptive factor is that she's doing this in Texas. The last time a Democratic nominee came to this state to campaign in the final days of early voting was Bill Clinton in 1992. And he got within 3.5 points of George H.W., the hometown kid here in Texas. So that's kind of interesting. But I think Trump really gets this stuff. Unfortunately, I hate to say it, because it comes at such great expense to this country. One last thing to end this comment on an optimistic note. We have faced this stuff before and we've overcome it. Franklin's famous words, a republic if you can keep it. We could have gone any number of directions. Lincoln reminding us that we might very well lose the last best hope of Earth. FDR, in hindsight, that was the obvious path this country was going to take, but we've got to remember that Nazis were rallying in Madison Square Garden with swastikas openly. Fascism was a possible path at a time of extraordinary economic dislocation. People frustrated with the status quo. The system was not working for them. It wasn't clear at the time that FDR and the Democratic Party and even democracy was going to be the path that we were going to pursue. And so we've overcome these challenges before, sometimes against much greater odds. I'm confident that we can, and I'm very hopeful that we will overcome them again. But we are working against one of the most talented operators politically that we have ever seen, that the world has ever seen. So it's going to really take everything from everyone to overcome this.
The one dynamic I remember from past years that seems almost to have the status of conventional wisdom is in a very close race, the late votes break against the incumbent and for the challenger. Let's say that's right, although if you have thoughts about it, please serve them up. But has Harris succeeded in being the challenger here? A tough road to hoe. On the other hand, he's the former president, and man, once again, to your exhaustion point, he's sure familiar and tired territory. Who's got the incumbent and who's got the challenger kind of ribbons here?
Trump is the incumbent, for sure. He's
For
ubiquitous. Sure. He's never gone away. He has been a part of the political conversation for 9 straight years. We've had no break. Kamala Harris was largely undefined until 3 months ago. So she is the change agent here, which is why I think some Democratic operatives and some in the media were frustrated by her, or pointing out that she didn't make a distinction between her and Biden.
In the CNN town hall?
Right.
Yeah.
And
on The View.
Right. The View also. And of course, the Trump campaign recognizes that. They want her to be the incumbent. That's why they keep tying her to Biden. And I mean, she is his vice president. She's vice president of the United States, but largely unknown by a lot of people. So I think there were a couple missed opportunities in defining herself or separating herself as the change agent from that perspective. Again, that's in a normal political environment when you have the other side compared to the other side. I mean, for God's sakes, there's really no comparison here. But I think that it will be a decision between whether people want to go back. I thought that her moniker of "we won't go back" very early, particularly for women. I run a women's organization in the Seneca Project, and one of our ads is called "We Won't Go Back." And it was actually before Kamala was on the ticket. And I'm like, okay, well, we're on to something here. But that's because for women, the MAGA policies, Trump's abortion bans, and what they're trying to do is setting women back. And for Kamala Harris to embrace that, I think that helps galvanize women and reminds people what it was like under Donald Trump. Are we trying to go back to that? Because we have collective amnesia a lot in this country. We forget how bad it actually was under Donald Trump with the chaos and the fatigue and the unprofessionalism and unethical behavior and the corruption and all of the things. And do we want to give that guy the levers of power again and go back to that? Because he represents a very regressive view where she represents the future. She has to continue to prosecute that. I hope that she does. The fact that Donald Trump continues to talk about the 2020 election, he's doing it again today. He put out another ranting, insane tweet claiming a cease and desist to legal scholars and attorneys about the sanctity of the upcoming election, and that there is all this proof of the, quote, cheating and skullduggery that took place during the 2020 election by Democrats, and that they're going to come after with all of this vim and vigor, use the power of the federal government to come after the Democrats who cheated. When I win, those people that cheated will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. This is what Donald Trump is proclaiming right now. Again, he's saying those involved in unscrupulous behavior will be sought out, caught, and prosecuted at levels unfortunately never seen before in our country. This should scare the hell out of every single law-abiding American.
And I'll just add, under Attorney General Eileen Cannon, they will be.
Right. And Homeland Security Secretary Stephen Miller. I mean, people need to pay attention to who Donald Trump's surrounding himself with.
I think that there is, and we've seen this in our own NBC News polling, some nostalgia for Trump, which to me tells me the electorate sees him as the challenger and her as the incumbent. She is the Harris in the Biden-Harris administration. They have had 4 years. They are the group of people that people know. The government helped them make their way out of the pandemic. The Biden-Harris administration is the administration that did that. This is a moment where, yes, it was very important for her to draw contrast with how she would be different than Biden. I also think that it's completely disingenuous, and yet Republicans are still doing it, to pretend that as vice president, she should have been pulling the levers of government, right? Because I don't remember legislation that Mike Pence or Vice President Biden or Vice President Dick Cheney sponsored, and yet here we are. That's disingenuous, but it is incumbent on her to continue drawing the differences and showing who she would be as her own kind of person. I do think, though, when I talk about nostalgia showing up in our polling, one of our recent NBC News polls showed that Trump's approval rating retroactively from a Monday morning quarterback perspective, it was closer to 50%. I mean, crazy. I don't remember him ever seeing numbers like that when he was in office. He was always technically underwater. And in our poll, I think he was at like 47 or 48. And so I do think that there is a little bit of rose-colored glasses in looking back, thinking, oh, well, it was the before pandemic times. I mean, like that whole period, 2020 through 2021, it's kind of a wash for people, I think. I mean, just emotionally, people lost time in their lives. They lost loved ones, all of that. But like, there's a nostalgia factor with Trump as well. And that's why I think the Harris campaign has changed their tune in kind of Battle for the Soul of the Nation 2.0. They're trying to remind people of who this guy is. Not just, I think she nails him when she says he is an unserious man in many ways, and yet he is serious in the ways that we talk about from a democracy, small d perspective. I think that's actually quite a salient way to talk about him.
And he has an enemies list, and I have a to-do list.
I love that line.
I think that was also a really powerful line that I think she's going to lean into more and more in these final days as well.
Let's talk about the final days. All three of you have been really pretty deep in the workings of a campaign, but from different perspectives, covering it, advising it, being the candidate. in a close race? Is there consideration of wild Hail Mary passes? Are people, because they're pros at this level, generally cool-headed? What's the feel, do you think, or do you know, Allie, from your own reporting inside? Let's stick with the Harris campaign.
Harris campaign, mission-oriented, tune out the noise, do the job, get out the vote. For every Democrat, and they exist, who calls me or calls another reporter and is airing their concern about how this election is going to go, and certainly we will see those stories. We have seen those stories. They will continue. They are real. That's a palpable thing. Reporting happens in real time. It's a snapshot of how Democrats in a small subsect or large subsect feel about the nominee and the race. But for every one of those stories, I see a few more posts from Democratic operatives or people who exist in that kind of universe saying, instead of saying that, go out and knock some doors. And candidly, I see the same thing on the Republican side. And so at this point, it is a moment where, and I've never been the candidate, nor ever will I be, Congressman, you have job security, but I do think from a campaign perspective and from a reporter perspective, the moment that I start hearing frantic texts on background from anyone in either orbit, we're not there, but that's a pivot point. And I don't see that pivot point, at least not yet right now.
So you see stability and professionalism in the Harris ranks right now.
Look, yeah, because what else can you do, right? I mean, there are always going to be people outside that core who have opinions. Certainly on a presidential campaign, there is no shortage of opinions, but the same goes for Trump. I mean, remember the fact, and I know we were leaving him out of this, but remember, there were various points where Nikki Haley was going on Fox News and saying, hey guys, maybe this isn't how we should be talking about women. There were other times where Republican strategists, I believe Karl Rove and others were among them, saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be insulting our voters. Maybe we should try a different message. Maybe, there's always people outside who have opinions. And certainly for both campaigns, it's always incumbent on a campaign and senior staff to keep a cool head about this. I mean, Congressman O'Rourke, I imagine you would agree, if you were in the home stretch of any campaign and people were sniping about what you were and weren't doing, you'd be, I think, concerned if your campaign managers were freaking out about that as well. And you have the benefit of knowing her advisors keenly in these kinds of situations.
Yeah.
Right.
I saw an interview with Mick Mulvaney not too long ago, and if there were ever anyone I expected to criticize, perhaps unfairly, the Harris campaign, it would be someone like Mick Mulvaney. And he just said, I think the way that they're running this could not be improved upon. If I were to advise him, I'd say, keep doing exactly what you're doing. I think he meant it earnestly. The confidence with which the vice president is speaking, with the way she's walking, the way she's moving. It's that old line. They may not remember what she said, but they'll never forget how you made them feel. The way she's making people feel, the smiles on people's faces. And is there anxiety out there? Absolutely. But I thought perhaps the best speech at the DNC this summer was Michelle Obama saying, don't wait to be asked to do something. Don't be sniping and griping on the sidelines. Get in and do something. And I was just in Phoenix and Tempe and Tucson, one of these battleground states, talking to and working alongside these great volunteers all across Arizona who've come together. They're knocking doors. It's 96 degrees in Phoenix today, a lot hotter than the rest of the country. Not easy to do. You're going to doors where there's one or two dogs that may be chasing you down before you can even make it to knock on that front door. But they're doing the work. And to a person, they have a smile on their face because they're not scrolling through Twitter. They're not reading the polls. They're not worrying and wondering. They are taking action. And so I just have to commend the Harris campaign for finding a way to put everyone to work who wants to do something better. Voting is insufficient to the task at hand. I mean, you've got to do it, right? And that's important, but that cannot be all that you do if you really care about this country. And if you see things in the terms that Tara laid out at the very beginning, the consequences of us being found wanting at the end of the day on November 5th are absolutely catastrophic to this country and our project of democracy. It's just not hyperbole to say that it might very well end. It's not Kamala Harris saying that. It's not Beto O'Rourke saying that. It is General Kelly saying that. It is General Mattis saying that. It is General Milley saying that. I mean, these are apolitical career public servants who've literally put their lives on the line. In one case, lost their son in service to this country. They are saying that right now. So, as TR would say, do what you can with what you have, where you are. That is us at this moment.
I had some more questions, but to me, there's an end. Thank you so much, Beto O'Rourke, Tara Setmayer, Ali Vitali. Hope to be talking to you soon in one semblance or another of the democratic experiment.
Stay sane and drink water, my friends.
Yes,
There you go.
indeed. If we can keep it.
Thank you so much to Beto, Tara, and Ali. And thank you very much, listeners, for tuning in to Talking Feds. If you like what you've heard, please tell a friend to subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts or wherever they get their podcasts. And please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube, where we are posting full episodes, talking books, and bonus video content. You can follow us on Twitter at TalkingFedsPod, and you can look to see our latest offerings on Patreon. Talking Feds remains a completely independent production. So if you like the work we do and are inclined to support the show, joining our Patreon is the best way to do it. Thanks for tuning in, and don't worry, as long as you need answers, the Feds will keep talking. Talking Feds is produced by Catherine Devine, associate producer Gabriella Glick, sound engineering by Matt McCardle. Rosie Dawn Griffin, David Lieberman, Hamza Mahadrenathan, Emma Maynard, and Hallie Necker are our contributing writers. Production assistance by Akshaj Turbailu and Sebastian Navarro. Thanks very much to the great Jack Black for explaining the limitations on political campaign advertising. Our music, as always, is by the amazing Philip Glass. Talking Feds is a production of Delito LLC. I'm Harry Littman. Talk to you later.